At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, a layer of warm tropical mist hung over the WWII airfield in New Guinea. Beneath the left wing of a silver P-38 Lightning, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched in silence, his hands still black with grease. The metallic scent of fuel and engine oil filled the humid air as he watched Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a 23-year-old pilot from Iowa, prepare for another mission. It was supposed to be routine, but McKenna knew better. Routine missions were the ones that didn't come back. Hayes had flown 6 combat missions. 6 times he'd faced the blinding sun and the rising red circles of Japan's fighters. 6 times he'd returned without a kill. Ahead of him that morning were 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, waiting beyond the clouds to intercept the patrol. Hayes would be flying straight into them, straight into death. For 8 months, McKenna had lived with the P-38s, slept beside them, repaired them, learned their moods. He knew every sound, every vibration, every secret of their twin-engined, twin-boom design. At high altitude, the Lightning was a beast, fast, heavy, devastating in a dive. But there was a flaw, one so small that engineers in California called it negligible, and so deadly that it was killing pilots every day. The P-38 couldn't turn with a Zero. The Japanese fighter was lighter, more agile, built for knife fighting in the sky. In a horizontal turn, a Zero could carve a circle in half the time it took the P-38. In that half-second gap lived death. American doctrine was clear. Never turn with a Zero. Use speed, use altitude, strike from above, and climb away before they could react. Hit-and-run warfare. Hayes had tried it 5 times, and 5 times it had failed. The Zeros had learned the pattern. They baited American pilots into turning fights, slipping inside their radius, then tearing them apart from behind. In the past 6 weeks, the 5th Air Force had lost 37 Lightnings over the Pacific. Each pilot followed doctrine. Each one died anyway. McKenna watched them go. Young men with sunburned faces and quiet confidence, only to see their names later stenciled on supply crates heading home. The manuals blamed pilot error. The officers blamed nerves. But McKenna knew the truth. The pilots weren't the problem. The problem lived inside the machine. A fraction of slackness, barely a whisper of looseness in the aileron control cables that ran from the cockpit through the twin booms to the tail. At full deflection, the cables allowed 3/8 of an inch of free play, enough to delay the roll of the aircraft by a fraction of a second. In air combat, that fraction meant everything. McKenna had reported it 2 months before. The engineering officer shrugged. Within factory specs, he said. Adjusting it would void the Lockheed warranty. Unauthorized modification was grounds for court-martial. Regulations were clear. But war had a way of exposing the weakness of regulations. That morning, McKenna looked up at the man climbing into the cockpit and felt the weight of that rule book pressing against his chest. He knew what the manual said. He also knew that if something didn't change, Robert Hayes would die before noon. He tightened his jaw, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and made a decision that would quietly alter the course of the air war in the Pacific. The tropical airfield at WWII had become a graveyard in slow motion. Each morning, the same ritual played out: the rising hum of Allison engines, the smell of hot oil and cordite, the sight of silver aircraft glinting in the sun as they took off in formation, and each afternoon, fewer of them returned. James McKenna had stopped counting the planes that didn't come back. He remembered the pilots instead. He remembered their faces, their voices, and the way they'd nod at him before taxiing away, trusting his hands with their lives. The first to die under his watch was Lieutenant David Chen, July 9, 1943. 3 weeks in the theater. From Sacramento. Talked often about his father's garage and the smell of motor oil on summer mornings. McKenna had liked him. They'd both been car mechanics before the war. Young men who once fixed engines for fun and now did it to keep men alive. That morning, Chen took off at 6:15 for a fighter sweep over Guinea. 2 hours later, his aircraft limped back, bullet holes stitched across the left boom.
He climbed out, shaking his head, and said the Zero had moved like smoke. He'd tried to dive away, like the manual said, but the lightning lagged, as if the controls were caught in syrup. McKenna inspected the holes. Tight grouping, perfect lead. The Zero pilot had anticipated exactly where Chen's plane would be. That shouldn't have been possible, not if the aircraft had responded instantly. 3 weeks later, Chen was dead, shot down over Rabaul in another lightning. Same story, same delay, same outcome. Official cause, pilot error. But McKenna knew better. The next was Captain William Morrison, 11 kills, one of the sharpest flyers in the group. August 3, 1943, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. McKenna wasn't there, but he heard the radio traffic. Morrison's voice, calm but strained. Controls feel mushy. Can't roll fast enough. Then static. Then nothing. The wreckage confirmed what the survivors already knew. The plane had been fine, within spec, perfectly built, perfectly doomed. Morrison's friend, Rodriguez, another crew chief, tore through the wreckage, desperate to prove the engineers wrong. Every control, every cable, every bolt, within tolerance. It was the same hollow phrase that haunted every crash. McKenna began to hear it in his sleep, within tolerance. By mid-August, 17 pilots were dead. Some had been friends, others he'd known only by the sound of their laughter during pre-flight checks. Each had died inside machines that worked exactly as the manual said they should. Every night McKenna lay awake listening to the tropical rain hammer the tin roof of the maintenance shed, his mind replaying the same question. How many seconds of slack equal a human life? He started noticing things, the faint vibration of loose cables, the tone they made when plucked, that soft metallic twang that told him something wasn't right. Other mechanics couldn't hear it, but McKenna could. The P-38s all sounded slightly off, slightly tired. He told Rodriguez again that the cables were the real problem. Rodriguez laughed bitterly. "Then fix it," he said. "Just don't get caught." But fixing it meant breaking rules written by men sitting behind desks 7,000 miles away in California. Men who didn't have to watch kids burn in aluminum coffins. The manual said never improvise. The war said otherwise. The doctrine was clear. Never turn with zero. But doctrine couldn't feel the sweat dripping from your gloves as tracers streaked past your canopy. Doctrine couldn't smell aviation fuel and blood in the same breath. That disconnect between theory and survival haunted every mechanic, every pilot. Lieutenant Hayes had flown 6 missions by now, following every instruction to the letter, diving from the sun, climbing back to altitude, never staying in a turn, yet he'd never scored a single kill. Each time the Zeros vanished into the clouds, laughing ghosts of the Pacific. And each time, Hayes came back more hollow, more withdrawn. The war was turning him into a shadow. Then came the 5th mission, August 14th, over Finshofen. Hayes watched his wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21 years old, get isolated and surrounded. The radio crackled with panic. Parker's voice, high, desperate. "She won't turn. She won't—" Gunfire cut him off. A second later, silence. Hayes landed alone. That night the barracks was quiet except for the sound of tropical rain hitting the tin roof of the maintenance shed. Parker's bed stayed empty. His belongings were boxed and labeled, his maintenance log marked, no mechanical issues. Another pilot error. McKenna had signed off Parker's aircraft that morning. Every screw, every cable, perfect. And yet Parker was gone. McKenna sat in the hangar that night staring at his oil-stained hands. He realized the truth. It wasn't the pilots dying. It was the system killing them. The manuals, the tolerances, the blind obedience to numbers written in offices oceans away, they were the real enemy. Somewhere deep down, a mechanic's instinct began to whisper louder than the regulations ever could. The whisper that said, if the engineers won't fix it, you will. The night before the mission that would change everything, the air at WWII hung heavy and wet, thick with the scent of oil and rain. The generators hummed in the distance, their low vibration mixing with the buzz of tropical insects against the hangar lights. It was late, close to midnight, and Technical Sergeant James McKenna was still working alone. Every mechanic else had gone to sleep, but McKenna couldn't. He sat on the concrete floor beside Lieutenant Hayes' P-38, the same aircraft that had nearly been his coffin days earlier. The left boom panel was open, its guts of cables and pulleys gleaming under the yellow bulb. McKenna reached inside and felt the control line, cold metal, slick with oil. He pulled. The cable moved before the resistance caught, maybe 3/8 of an inch of play. That's slack again. It wasn't much, but he knew it was there. And that small distance, he thought, was what stood between life and death. His mind drifted to the faces of the dead, Chen, Morrison, Parker, and to the smell of bird metal and jungle smoke that always came after the reports of their deaths. Each had followed orders. Each had trusted a machine that couldn't quite listen fast enough. And here, in this humid silence, McKenna decided that obedience was overrated. He took out his small canvas tool bag, worn at the seams, and dug until he found a piece of piano wire he had salvaged weeks ago from a wrecked Lightning. 6 inches long, high tensile, stiff as truth. He had kept it without knowing why. Now he did. He placed the wire on the floor and stared at it for a long time. Then he pulled a pair of pliers from his pocket and began to bend. The metal resisted, groaning as it curved. Sweat dripped from his forehead. Twice the wire slipped and sliced his thumb. He hissed, wiped the blood on his coveralls, and kept going. Finally, after 8 long minutes, the wire was shaped like a crooked Z, a makeshift tensioner that would pull the control cable tight and erase the deadly slack. It was simple, too simple, but it could work. The hangar was suffocatingly quiet. Somewhere outside, thunder rumbled over the jungle. McKenna's hands trembled as he unpinned the aileron cable. The space inside the boom was cramped. He could barely fit his arm through. Holding the flashlight in his teeth, he fought with the fittings, his shoulder scraping the aluminum frame until blood mixed with sweat. The flashlight beam quivered as he worked, shadows dancing over the metal bones of the plane. He dropped the clevis pin once, cursed softly, and spent 5 full minutes groping in the dark to find it. Every sound, the scrape of metal, the clink of tools, felt dangerously loud, as if the entire Pacific War might hear him breaking the rules. If the engineering officer found him, it wouldn't just be a reprimand. It would be a court-martial. Unauthorized modification of flight controls was a federal crime. He could lose everything: rank, career, freedom. But none of that mattered compared to the image that haunted him. Robert Hayes, 23, sitting in that cockpit, flying straight into a wall of zeros he couldn't outturn. He thought of Hayes' face earlier that evening when the young pilot had found him at the hangar and asked in a low, tired voice, "Isn't there anything you can do to make her roll faster?" He had seen the fear in the boy's eyes, fear disguised as courage. McKenna had told him to come back in the morning. Now, here in the dark, he was keeping that promise. At 1:15 a.m., he pushed the Z-shaped wire into place, threading it between the cable and the pulley. The fit was perfect, tight, almost too tight. He forced the pin back in, locked it, and pulled the cable again. No slack. The control surface moved instantly, crisp, alive. McKenna exhaled for the first time in an hour. He replaced the inspection panel, wiped his hands, and sat back on the floor. For a moment he just listened, the faint drip of water from the hangar roof, the distant rumble of engines, the hum of life continuing despite war. Then the fear hit him, the realization of what he had done. He just altered a warplane without authorization. If that modification failed in flight, Hayes would die and McKenna would be the man who killed him. His heart pounded as he stepped outside into the tropical night. The air was dense and still, the jungle a black wall beyond the runway. Somewhere far away, Japanese bombers droned across the sea. He looked up at the stars above the Pacific, cold, uncaring, and whispered to himself, "God, please let it hold." He didn't sleep. He lay in his bunk staring at the corrugated ceiling, Every creak of the bays sounded like the ticking of fate. Dawn arrived slowly, bleeding orange over the palms. At 0630 hours, McKenna walked to the flight line. The ground crews were fueling Hayes' P-38, arming the guns, checking the engines. The young pilot appeared soon after, his flight suit half-zipped, helmet in hand. He gave McKenna a nod, unaware of the secret lying inside his left boom. At 0742 hours, Hayes taxied out. The roar of twin Allison engines filled the field. McKenna stood motionless, his chest tight, watching as the lightning lifted into the bright New Guinea sky and banked northwest toward enemy airspace. He kept watching long after the silver shape vanished behind the clouds. And then there was nothing left to do but wait, for either vindication or disaster.
The jungle was quiet that morning, save for the distant hum of engines fading into the horizon. The squadron of P-38s shimmered like a formation of silver arrows, climbing through the mist toward the rising sun. On the ground, McKenna remained frozen beside the runway, unable to tear his eyes from the sky. Sweat trickled down his neck, even though the morning air was cool. Somewhere up there, Lieutenant Robert Hayes was about to test the wire that could either save him or kill him instantly. At 8:14 hours, radio operators confirmed contact. Hayes's flight, 4 P-38s, had intercepted a formation of 9 zeros over the Huon Gulf. The engagement began as a textbook ambush. The Americans had the sun behind them, perfect altitude, the advantage of surprise. Hayes flew number 3 position, tucked slightly behind his element leader. When the call came to attack, the 4 Lightnings rolled into a steep dive. From the cockpit, Hayes saw the ocean turn from blue to white foam as he gained speed. The wind screamed through the twin booms. His altimeter spun like a wheel. Ahead, the Japanese fighters scattered, sunlight flashing across their wings. Hayes chose his target, a 0 near the rear of the formation, and locked in. His thumb tightened on the trigger. The P-38 shook violently as the guns roared. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon spitting fury into the morning sky. Tracers reached out glowing threads of death. A few hit, sparking along the Zero's wing, but it wasn't enough. The Japanese pilot rolled sharply right and dove. Hayes followed. That was the moment it should have ended. Doctrine said never to chase a Zero through a turn. Every muscle memory screamed that it was suicide. But Hayes didn't think, he felt. He rolled into the dive, and that's when he sensed it. The control stick moved, and the plane answered instantly. No hesitation, no lag. The Lightning snapped into the turn like a living thing. The response was so sharp that Hayes almost overcorrected. The P-38 felt weightless, like a predator unleashed. He yanked the nose through the horizon. The Zero filled his gun sight again. Hayes squeezed the trigger. The burst lasted only 3 seconds, but it was enough. The rounds walked up the fuselage, slicing through the rising sun emblem, tearing into the cockpit. The Zero exploded in a bright flash and spiraled downward, trailing a ribbon of black smoke that vanished into the jungle canopy below. Hayes had his first kill. But there was no time to celebrate. His wingmen shouted over the radio, "3 more diving from above!" Hayes looked up. 3 Zeros were screaming down from altitude, closing fast. They'd seen their comrade die. Now they wanted revenge. Hayes jammed the throttles forward, feeling the twin Allisons howl. But the Japanese planes were faster in the dive. He could hear the rounds slicing the air behind him. Instinct said to run. Doctrine demanded retreat, but doctrine was written by men who'd never been chased by death. Hayes threw the Lightning into a left roll, pulling with all his strength. The P-38 snapped around with terrifying speed, its wings cutting the air cleanly. The Zeros overshot, one slipping dangerously close across his nose. Hayes reacted before thought, fired a burst, hit the lead Zero square in the ring root. The plane disintegrated, its pilot never even ejecting. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The remaining Zeros tried to scissor, weaving back and forth to bait him into overshooting. But this time, the Lightning could match them move for move. Each time they reversed direction, Hayes followed seamlessly, rolling into the next turn as if the machine could read his mind. There was no delay, no struggle, just perfect synchronicity between man and machine. 1-0 made a fatal mistake. It reversed too sharply, bleeding too much speed. Hayes dove into its blind spot, closed the distance to less than 200 feet, and fired. The tracers tore through the fuselage. The aircraft erupted, scattering fragments through the air. Pieces of the Zero struck Hayes's right boom with a metallic clatter. He felt the vibration in his bones. Then silence. The last Zero fled, smoke trailing behind. Hayes didn't chase. His ammunition was almost gone and his fuel gauge trembled near red. He climbed back to altitude, joined what was left of his formation, and turned for home. The entire fight had lasted 17 minutes. When his P-38 touched down at 09:03 hours, McKenna was already there. He stood rigid as the Lightning rolled to a stop, engines sputtering, propellers winding down. The smell of burned gunpowder drifted from the nose. Hayes opened the canopy and climbed out. His flight suit was drenched with sweat, his eyes wide, his hands trembling. He walked straight toward McKenna. The mechanic said nothing. He didn't have to. Hayes looked him dead in the eyes and whispered, almost disbelieving, "It worked." McKenna felt his knees weaken. Relief hit him like a wave. He wanted to laugh, to shout, to confess what he had done, but he stayed silent. All he managed was a nod. The two men stood there, surrounded by the roaring silence of the airfield, both knowing that something extraordinary had just happened, something no one else yet understood. And high above them, the morning sky still echoed with the invisible tremor of those 17 minutes, the moment when a forbidden piece of wire changed the balance of air combat in the Pacific.
That evening, as the tropical sun bled red into the horizon, a strange energy rippled through the base. Pilots who had watched Hayes fight from altitude couldn't stop talking about it. Something about his P-38 looked different in the sky, faster, sharper, almost alive. Captain Frank Mitchell, the veteran leader of the 475th Fighter Group, had seen it himself from 15,000 feet. He'd watched Hayes roll through maneuvers that should have been impossible for a Lightning. To his eyes, the plane had moved like it was half its weight, and Mitchell knew every pilot in New Guinea by skill and style. Hayes was solid, but not that good. Whatever had happened today wasn't luck or instinct. It was something mechanical. After the debrief, Mitchell found Hayes still trembling from adrenaline, his hands shaking as he filled out the mission report. 3 confirmed kills, 1 probable. Hayes could barely explain it. "It just responded," he said, eyes distant, like the airplane finally woke up. When Mitchell asked if maintenance had done anything to his aircraft, Hayes hesitated, then said, "You should talk to McKenna." 2 hours later, Mitchell found Technical Sergeant McKenna in the maintenance area, sleeves rolled up, wiping grease off his hands. The hangar lights flickered against his oil-stained coveralls. McKenna didn't look like someone who had changed the tide of war, just another tired mechanic trying to keep the machines alive one more day. Mitchell didn't waste time. "What did you do to Hayes's plane?" he asked. For a moment, McKenna said nothing. Then he sighed, looked around to make sure no one else was listening, and told the truth. He explained the slack in the cables, the regulation tolerances, the piano wire shaped into a Z, the extra tension that made the controls react instantly. Every word sounded like an admission of guilt. When he finished, Mitchell just stared at him. "You realize that's completely unauthorized?" "I do," McKenna replied quietly. "But it works." The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Can you do it to mine?" McKenna blinked. "Sir, if it goes wrong—" "That it's on me," Mitchell interrupted. "I've lost 4 pilots this month. I'm done watching kids die because a rule book says we can't touch a cable." That night, under the same humming lights, McKenna installed the second piano wire tensioner. Same careful process, same quiet defiance. Mitchell flew it at dawn. When he landed, his grin said everything. "It rolls like a fighter, not a freight truck," he told his wingman. "Feels alive." Within hours, the rumor spread across the squadron like fire in dry grass. By August 20th, 9 aircraft had the modification. Pilots whispered about it in the ready room. Mechanics shared glances in the hangar. They didn't talk openly. Too dangerous. But everyone knew something extraordinary was happening beneath the surface of routine. The unofficial name became the wire fix. Each night, more crew chiefs came to McKenna, pretending to borrow tools or check parts, only to ask in a low voice, "How did you do it?" McKenna would show them. Cut the piano wire, bend it into a Z, slip it between the cable and pulley. 8 minutes of work that turned a sluggish fighter into a predator. The transformation was immediate. Lieutenant Hayes downed 2 more zeros on August 22nd. Mitchell 3 more on the 25th. Every engagement told the same story. P-38s rolling faster, reacting quicker, surviving fights that would have killed them weeks earlier. It wasn't superstition, it was physics, and a mechanic's defiance. By early September, roughly 40 Lightnings in New Guinea carried McKenna's secret fix. Officially, no one knew. Inspections never caught it because the crew chiefs had learned to remove the tensioners before the checks and reinstall them afterwards. The engineering officer couldn't explain why performance reports were improving so rapidly. Pilots knew, mechanics knew, but no one dared to write it down. And then, thousands of miles away, the enemy began to notice. Japanese flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet recorded something unsettling. American P-38s, once predictable, were now maneuvering with unusual agility. Dogfight tactics that had worked flawlessly for 2 years, draw the Lightning into a turn, reverse and shoot, no longer worked. Japanese aces found themselves outrolled, outturned, outmatched. The first to report it in disbelief was Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most feared fighter pilots. On September 3, 1943, over WWII, Sakai engaged a P-38 using his usual trick, baiting the American into a turn, then reversing to get inside his roll. But this time, the Lightning reversed with him. Fast, precise, unnaturally sharp. Sakai barely avoided collision. For the first time in his career, he had to dive away to save himself. Later in his combat report, he wrote that the American fighter rolled like a snake, unpredictable and dangerous. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders puzzled over the sudden change. They examined wrecked Lightnings from crash sites, searching for clues, new engines, new weapons, anything visible. They found nothing. The planes looked identical to every previous model. The secret sat buried inside the booms, invisible, disguised as factory metal. Even if they had found the small Z-shaped wire, they would never have guessed its purpose. Meanwhile, inside the U.S. squadrons, morale began to shift. For months, the Zero had ruled the skies, confident and untouchable. Now that confidence was cracking. American pilots no longer dreaded turning engagements, they welcomed them. Each new dogfight became proof that the change was real. For the first time in the Pacific theater, the hunter was becoming the hunted. But for McKenna, the man who started it all, the revolution remained a whisper. He still worked every morning in the same grease-stained coveralls, still signed the same maintenance logs. He didn't talk about the wire, didn't claim credit. He just kept installing it, quietly, one plane at a time, one life at a time. And though no one yet realized it, the balance of air power in the Pacific had already shifted, thanks not to generals or engineers, but to a single mechanic who refused to obey a line in a manual.
By mid-September 1943, whispers of confusion began to swirl through the Japanese ranks like smoke. Fighter command logs from Rabaul and WWII grew uneasy in tone. American P-38s maneuver with new ferocity. Roll rate appears increased, turning engagements no longer decisive. For 2 years, the Zero had been the undisputed king of the Pacific. dancing around every Allied fighter with graceful precision. Its pilots had grown confident, too confident. Now, in the skies above New Guinea, that confidence was evaporating. Combat data told the story with cold precision. In July, U.S. forces had lost 2 lightnings for every 0 destroyed. By August, the ratio was 1.3 to 1. By September, it had shifted to near parity. No one could explain it. The planes were the same, the tactics unchanged, yet the results spoke for themselves. Somewhere, somehow, the Americans had found a hidden advantage. Japanese analysts at the 11th Air Fleet searched for answers. They studied wrecks, interviewed surviving pilots, and even interrogated captured Americans. Nothing made sense. The P-38s they fought were not faster in climb, not stronger in firepower, only more precise, more alive. It was as if the aircraft themselves had learned to think. Veterans who once called the Lightning clumsy now described it with wary respect. Among them was Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace with 64 kills. After his encounter on September 3rd, he returned to base shaken. In the debriefing, he described the fight as unnatural. The American, he said, rolled inside his turn, something no Lightning should be able to do. The officers dismissed it as exhaustion, but Sakai knew what he had seen. "They have changed," he told a comrade that evening, staring at the setting sun. "The Americans have changed their machines." As more reports echoed his experience, unease spread. Japanese pilots, once fearless, began hesitating before engaging Lightnings. The reversal was psychological as much as tactical. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the hunters were afraid of becoming prey. In contrast, life at WWII Airfield carried on with quiet defiance. Mechanics moved through the hangars at night, slipping small coils of piano wire into toolboxes, whispering instructions to each other under their breath. No one wrote anything down. No memos, no reports, no diagrams, just word of mouth passed from crew chief to crew chief like a secret prayer. The rule was simple: cut, bend, install, and never tell. By early October, over 40 P-38s in New Guinea carried the modification. Inspections couldn't find it. Crew chiefs had learned to remove the wire before official checks and reinstall it afterward. Pilots joked that the aircraft felt haunted, that some invisible spirit had taken residence in their control systems. But to the men who had fought for months under the shadow of the Zero, that ghost was salvation. The transformation rippled through the air war. Missions that once ended in losses now ended in victories. Dogfights that had been desperate struggles became swift executions. In September alone, the Japanese lost 38 fighters to P-38s while shooting down only 22. For the first time in the Pacific Campaign, the Lightning held the advantage. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some squadrons switched to hit-and-run tactics, mimicking the very doctrine the Americans had used against them. But abandoning the Zero's famed maneuverability meant surrendering its soul. Others doubled down on aggression, diving in close, firing at suicidal range. It only made the losses worse. Veteran pilots, men who once danced through aerial combat with deadly grace, began dying in droves. The Empire was bleeding its best. Meanwhile, in Washington and California, no one had the faintest idea why the Pacific kill ratios were suddenly improving. Reports reached the desks of Army Air Force Engineering Command, filled with phrases like unexplained performance consistency and minor control variance. The data looked promising but impossible. No one thought to credit the mechanics in the jungle. The official narrative credited better tactics, improved morale, or
field adjustments. No one mentioned the wire. On the ground, James McKenna kept his silence. He worked from dawn to dusk, sleeves rolled, cigarette clenched between his teeth, tightening cables and checking hydraulics like nothing had changed. When a pilot returned from a mission grinning and shouting about how responsive his lightning felt, McKenna would simply nod and mutter, "Glad she flies right for you." Inside, though, he felt a quiet, heavy pride, a mechanic's kind of pride, the kind that doesn't need medals or headlines, just proof that the machine now did what it was meant to do: keep men alive. Every night, as the jungle hummed and the engines cooled, McKenna would walk past the line of aircraft silhouetted against the moonlight. He would stop beside Hayes' P-38, run his hand along the left boom where the small Z-shaped wire slept hidden inside, and whisper, "Hold fast, girl." It was his secret ritual, his way of acknowledging the invisible piece of metal that had rewritten the rules of war. In September's final weeks, a new order circulated among Japanese fighter squadrons. Avoid engagement with P-38s unless in superior numbers. The tone of the directive was reluctant, almost ashamed. It marked an unspoken admission. The age of the Zero was ending. The machine that once ruled the Pacific skies was now outmatched by a humble American fighter, tuned to perfection by a grease-stained mechanic. Above the Pacific, the balance had shifted. The empire that once believed itself untouchable now looked up at a different kind of sky, one no longer theirs to own.
By October 1943, the transformation of the Pacific Air War was undeniable. The Army Air Forces in New Guinea had gone from losing squadrons to dominating the skies. The kill ratios, once depressing, now filled the reports with cautious optimism. Pilots who had returned home defeated only weeks earlier now wrote letters filled with hope. Commanders spoke of a turning tide. But no one, not even the officers at Lockheed in California, understood the real reason. The secret lived in the shadows, buried inside the twin booms of the P-38s, in a 6-inch strip of steel bent by a mechanic who had never even flown. It was an inspector from the engineering command who stumbled upon it first. During a routine check, he noticed inconsistent readings in the aileron cable tension of one aircraft. The difference was minor, barely measurable, but enough to raise suspicion. He ordered a deeper inspection. What he found made no sense. A small piece of piano wire, neatly fitted between the control cable and pulley, shaped into a tight Z. It looked factory-made, yet it wasn't in any manual. He traced it back to the WWII maintenance unit, then wrote a quiet report and sent it up the chain. For 3 weeks, it sat on desks, gathering dust while officers debated what to do. The modification violated every regulation in the Army Air Forces. It was unauthorized, untested, unapproved. But the field data didn't lie. Squadrons with the modification were surviving longer, fighting better, killing more. Finally, in November, Lockheed dispatched an engineering team from California to New Guinea. They arrived expecting to find chaos, field improvisations, safety hazards, perhaps even sabotage. What they found instead was elegant simplicity. They measured the cable tension, calculated the added stress, and ran flight tests. The results stunned them. The modification eliminated slack without increasing stress beyond tolerance. It didn't just work, it was brilliant. In the official report, the Lockheed engineers described it as a field-originated control enhancement. But they never named the originator. Regulations and pride wouldn't allow it. In corporate language, credit went to Lockheed Engineering Analysis. In truth, the improvement came from Technical Sergeant James McKenna, a man who had simply refused to watch another pilot die. The modification was quietly integrated into the new P-38J model, entering production in December 1943. No ceremony, no announcement. The design sheet simply noted, revised aileron cable tensioning assembly. For McKenna, there were no medals, no commendations. The war moved on faster than paperwork could follow. Yet among those who knew, word spread. Pilots who had flown with McKenna's wire whispered his name with respect that bordered on reverence. Hayes, who owed his life to that night in the hangar, flew 63 combat missions before the war ended. He shot down 11 Japanese aircraft, each kill a silent tribute to the man who had given his fighter a heartbeat. Every August 17th, on the anniversary of that first mission, Hayes would find a phone and call McKenna, sometimes from an airbase, sometimes from home, just to say, "Thank you for saving me." Captain Frank Mitchell, too, survived. He rose through the ranks, eventually commanding his own squadron. During the Philippine campaign, his P-38s cut through enemy fighters like blades through fog. 16 confirmed kills. When the war ended, he stayed in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1963. Every young maintenance officer under his command heard the same story, of the nameless sergeant who fixed a machine that engineers thought was flawless. "Never ignore the man who touches the machine," Mitchell would tell them. "He might see what you can't." And what of McKenna? When the war ended in 1946, he returned home to California. He went back to what he knew: engines, tools, and the quiet satisfaction of making things work. He opened a small garage in Long Beach in 1948. The sign outside simply read, "McKenna's Auto Service." For 42 years, he repaired cars, trucks, and farm engines. Neighbors knew him as the old mechanic who could fix anything. Few knew that he had once changed the course of an air war. He never talked about it. When asked about the war, he would shrug and say, "I fixed airplanes, that's all." But in the back of his shop, tucked among toolboxes and oil cans, hung a faded photograph. A young man in coveralls standing beside a gleaming P-38 Lightning, the jungle stretching behind him. On the back, written in fading pencil, were 5 words: August 1943, New Guinea. J.M. In 1991, nearly 50 years after the battle that made history, a military historian researching P-38 modifications stumbled upon the phrase "unauthorized cable tensioning adjustment" in maintenance logs from New Guinea. Curiosity, it led to veteran registries, then to a small garage on a quiet street in Long Beach. McKenna was 73, still working part-time. When the historian asked about the piano wire, McKenna smiled softly, wiping his hands on a rag. He said, "It wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing." The historian later estimated that McKenna's simple act had saved between 80 and 100 American pilots. McKenna didn't care for the number. He only remembered the faces, the ones who came back. Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, the others. That was enough. When James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88, his obituary mentioned that he had served as an aircraft mechanic in World War II. It did not mention the piano wire. It did not mention the lives he saved or the legacy he left in steel and silence. But for those who knew the story, that omission felt fitting. McKenna had never sought glory. He had sought perfection in a cable, in a role, in the thin line between death and survival. And somewhere across the Pacific, the ghosts of those who once flew under his care might still be whispering thanks into the endless blue.
Long after the guns fell silent and the Pacific turned calm again, the legend of the P-38 Lightning lived on. In museums, in documentaries, in the memories of the few who survived its thunder. But what no display ever revealed, what no factory record ever acknowledged, was that the Lightning's turning point had come not from engineers in starched uniforms, but from one man in grease-stained coveralls who had broken the rules to save others. In the post-war years, historians and enthusiasts would write endlessly about the brilliance of Lockheed's design, the twin booms, the power of its Allison engines, the way it could climb like no other Allied fighter. They wrote about the ace pilots, the killers, the tacticians, the heroes who wore flight jackets and medals.
But the name James McKenna rarely appeared. When it did, it was buried in the footnotes, a technical reference without emotion. Yet to the men who had known him, McKenna wasn't a footnote. He was the heartbeat of the squadron, the man who had given their aircraft something no factory could: instinct. In the post-war years, historians and enthusiasts would write endlessly about the brilliance of Lockheed's design, the twin booms, the power of its Allison engines, the way it could climb like no other Allied fighter. They wrote about the ace pilots, the killers, the tacticians, the heroes who wore flight jackets and medals. But the name James McKenna rarely appeared. When it did, it was buried in the footnotes, a technical reference without emotion. Yet to the men who had known him, McKenna wasn't a footnote. He was the heartbeat of the squadron, the man who had given their aircraft something no factory could: instinct. In the post-war years, historians and enthusiasts would write endlessly about the brilliance of Lockheed's design, the twin booms, the power of its Allison engines, the way it could climb like no other Allied fighter. They wrote about the ace pilots, the killers, the tacticians, the heroes who wore flight jackets and medals. But the name James McKenna rarely appeared. When it did, it was buried in the footnotes, a technical reference without emotion. Yet to the men who had known him, McKenna wasn't a footnote. He was the heartbeat of the squadron, the men who had given their aircraft something no factory could: instinct. In the decades that followed, the P-38 became a symbol of America's industrial triumph, a machine born from precision and mass production. But those who flew in 1943 knew the truth, that the real triumph came from improvisation, from a 6-inch piece of wire bent by hand in the back of a sweltering hangar. That act had changed everything, not through invention, but through defiance. The modification, now an official component of the P-38J and later models, continued to serve long after McKenna's name faded from the records. Every Lightning that rolled off the assembly line carried within it a ghost of his idea, a tensioner built into the control system, quietly ensuring that pilots would never again feel the deadly lag that had cost so many lives. Every maneuver, every victory, every safe return in those later years owed something invisible to that midnight repair in New Guinea. But McKenna never sought recognition. After the war, he refused interviews. When the local paper tried to profile the hero mechanic of Long Beach, he turned them away. His daughter once asked him why he didn't want credit. McKenna simply smiled and said, "The pilots got home. That's enough." His old friend Robert Hayes never stopped reminding him, though. Each August, like clockwork, Hayes would call. Sometimes he'd leave a message when McKenna was already asleep, his voice older now, rasped by time. "Just wanted to say it again, Sergeant. You saved me." When Hayes passed away in 1983, his family found among his things a single photograph, him and McKenna standing together in 1943, Hayes still in his flight suit, McKenna's hands stained black from oil. On the back, Hayes had written, "He fixed my plane, he fixed my fate." In 1991, when that historian rediscovered the logs, he wrote an article titled "The Wire That Changed the War." It was published in a small aviation journal, read by only a handful of enthusiasts. But among them were veterans who recognized the story instantly. Letters began arriving at McKenna's garage from all over the country. Pilots, crewmen, even widows of those who had flown P-38s. One read, "My husband came home from New Guinea in '44. He told me the plane felt different that year. Maybe he was flying one of yours." McKenna replied to every letter with the same humble line, "It wasn't mine. It was everyone's." He worked until his hands could no longer grip a wrench. When he finally sold the garage, he left behind few possessions. But on the wall of the small office, behind layers of dust and yellowed newspaper clippings, hung that same faded photo of him beside the lightning. The new owner never took it down. It stayed there, a silent witness to a story that the world had almost forgotten. Even today, deep within the archives of Lockheed Martin, the engineering drawings of the late-war P-38s still list that revised aileron system coded simply as Field Improvement 1943. No mention of McKenna, no note explaining its origin, just a sterile reference to a moment that had once been soaked in blood, sweat, and oil. But history, no matter how bureaucratic, has a way of remembering the human hand behind the machine. Veterans who visited the Pacific View Memorial Park in California sometimes left small tokens on McKenna's grave, a piece of wire, a worn mechanic's glove, or a single bullet casing polished to a shine. They understood what official records never could, that wars are not only won by strategy and weapons, but by the invisible acts of courage performed in silence. If you were to visit his old garage today, you'd find it changed. A different name above the door, modern cars on the lifts, but in the back office the photograph still hangs. The young man in coveralls stands proud beside the P-38 Lightning, the jungle of New Guinea in the background. The caption, faded but still legible, reads, August 1943. That image captures something the history books never will. The moment when one man, faced with rules that condemned others to die, decided that compassion mattered more than permission. The world never built statues for men like James McKenna. There were no parades, no medals pinned to his chest. But every time a pilot rolled his aircraft into a perfect turn, every time a fighter responded instantly to a pilot's command, McKenna's defiance lived on. He had given the P-38 its soul. And in that act, a single mechanic's refusal to accept within specification as good enough, he had proven a deeper truth about war and humanity, that the greatest innovations are not born in laboratories or boardrooms, but in the hearts of those who can't bear to lose one more friend. The sky over New Guinea has long since gone quiet. The jungle has swallowed the airfields. The rusted skeletons of old lightnings lie hidden beneath vines and soil. But somewhere inside those corroded frames, buried deep in forgotten metal, a small piece of wire may still be holding its shape, a relic of defiance, a fragment of compassion, a reminder that even in war, one man's hand can change the fate of hundreds. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough to the wind as it sweeps over those lost runways, you might still hear the faint echo of that twang, the sound of a cable pulled perfectly tight.